More than 8 million German children were transformed into fanatic soldiers of a genocidal ideology, not through direct violence, but through schools, games, songs and ceremonies designed to destroy their ability to think critically. In less than 12 years, the Nazi regime turned an entire generation into blind instruments of destruction. The indoctrination began at the age of 6 and never ended. Children swore eternal loyalty to Hitler, memorized racial propaganda as scientific truth, and learned that denouncing their own parents was an act of heroism. By 1939, millions of young people considered hatred as natural, sacrifice as glorious, and absolute obedience as sacred. They did not remember any other reality. The Hitler Youth, the mass indoctrination machine. The organization that had the deepest impact on German youth had modest origins. Founded in 1926 with just a few hundred members, the Hitler Youth grew exponentially following Hitler's rise to power. By 1933, the organization had 100,000 young people. By 1935, that number had risen to 3.5 million. But the true transformation occurred in December of 1936, when a law made membership mandatory for all young Germans between the ages of 10 and 18. At the forefront of this massive expansion was Baldur von Schirach, appointed leader of the Reich Youth at the age of 23. Schirach understood that youth loyalty was not gained solely through coercion, but by creating a structure that offered a sense of belonging, adventure, and purpose. The Hitler Youth was organized like an army, with clear hierarchies that allowed young people to rise from simple members to leadership positions over their peers. This pyramidal structure generated internal competition and fostered the ambition for power from an early age. Children began their integration into the system at the age of 6 in the Pimpfi, a preparatory stage where they learned Nazi songs, memorized party slogans, and participated in competitive games designed to identify the strongest and most aggressive. At the age of 10, they would formally enter the Deutsches Jungvolk, the German young people, where the training intensified dramatically. Recreational activities were mixed with basic military instruction, forced marches of 20 kilometers with full gear, nighttime navigation in forests, survival exercises in extreme conditions. The initiation ceremony into the Jungvolk represented a crucial moment. After months of preparation, the candidates had to pass rigorous physical tests, running 60 meters in 12 seconds, jumping from platforms 2.5 meters high, completing a march of 1.5 days with minimal supplies. Those who failed faced public humiliation and social rejection. The successful participated in nighttime ceremonies illuminated by torches, where they swore eternal loyalty to Adolf Hitler, promising to be willing to give their lives for the Führer at any moment. At the age of 14, young people entered the Hitler Youth proper. The training reached levels of complete military intensity. The boys learned to handle rifles and pistols, practiced throwing hand grenades, studied basic combat tactics, and navigated with military maps. Weekends and vacations were dedicated to camps that simulated real combat conditions. During these intensive sessions, young people spent whole days exposed to the elements, slept in makeshift tents, ate scarce rations, and participated in exercises that deliberately pushed them to the limit of physical endurance. The indoctrination was not exclusively physical. Each activity was accompanied by constant ideological instruction. The youth leaders explained that these trials strengthened the Aryan race, eliminating the weak and tempering the strong. The forced marches were presented as preparation for future territorial conquests. The survival exercises taught self-sufficiency for when the youth colonized Slavic territories in the east. Each blow, each pain, each moment of extreme exhaustion was reinterpreted as a necessary sacrifice for the 1,000-year Reich. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, indoctrinated young women with different but equally totalitarian purposes. While boys were being prepared as soldiers, girls learned their destiny as mothers of future Aryan warriors. The training emphasized gymnastics and athletics to develop healthy bodies capable of multiple pregnancies. Lessons in domestic economy were mixed with instruction on racial purity and the importance of selecting genetically superior partners. The girls memorized the Nuremberg laws, learned to identify Jewish racial characteristics, and received indoctrination about the danger of racial mixing. Summer camps represented the highlight of annual indoctrination. For weeks, away from any moderating family influence, young people lived in an environment of total Nazi immersion. Days began at 5 in the morning with flag raising and songs to the Führer. Activities followed non-stop: marches, exercises, athletic competitions, ideological classes, night ceremonies. Adult leaders constantly monitored the behavior of each young person, identifying those who showed exceptional enthusiasm or, on the contrary, signs of doubt or resistance. The system of punishments revealed the inherent cruelty of indoctrination. Young people who showed physical weakness faced humiliations designed to undermine their self-esteem. Those who questioned the Nazi doctrine were publicly denounced as traitors. The physical punishments were brutal: collective beatings, prolonged exposure to extreme cold or heat, deprivation of food. The objective was to create a herd mentality where individual dissent would be unthinkable. The effectiveness of the system lay in its ability to satisfy deep psychological needs of adolescents. The Hitler Youth offered adventure, camaraderie, clear structure, a sense of purpose, and the illusion of historical significance. For young people growing up in the economic instability of the post-war period, the organization promised certainty and power. The uniforms provided visible identity. The hierarchies allowed for advancement based on merit. The grand ceremonies generated intense emotional experiences that young people associated with transcendent meaning. By 1939, the Hitler Youth had absorbed or eliminated all alternative youth organizations in Germany. Scout groups, Catholic associations, independent sports clubs, all were dissolved or forcibly integrated. Authorities began to deny access to higher education and job opportunities to families whose children did not participate. The social pressure on non-members became unbearable. 10-year-old children reported classmates who did not attend meetings, teachers interrogated about absences, neighbors reported resistant families. When the war broke out in September 1939, Baldur von Schirach had accomplished his mission. 8 million young Germans had been shaped according to National Socialist principles. An entire generation considered militarism normal, racial supremacy natural, and the figure of Adolf Hitler sacred. These young people did not remember a Germany before Nazism. For them, the Hitler Youth did not represent indoctrination, but the only reality they had known: the Nazification of the educational system, turning classrooms into barracks. The transformation of the German educational system began with a massive and relentless purge. Between 1933 and 1935, more than 30,000 teachers were dismissed from their positions. Some were Jewish, others had politically unacceptable affiliations for the regime. Many had simply expressed doubts about National Socialism. The selection criteria were clear: academic competence was secondary to ideological loyalty. A mediocre but fanatically Nazi teacher served the regime better than a brilliant educator with reservations about Hitler. The National Socialist Teacher League, the League of National Socialist Teachers, took complete control over who could teach in Germany. Every teacher had to be affiliated with this organization and demonstrate active commitment to the Nazi cause. Teachers attended ideological training camps where they learned not pedagogical methodologies, but propaganda techniques. Each educator was expected to be first a political soldier and only secondarily an academic instructor. Performance evaluations measured the teacher's ability to instill National Socialist fanaticism, not to develop critical thinking. The rewriting of educational materials reached levels of perversion that are difficult to understand. Mathematics books incorporated problems designed to normalize genocide. A typical problem asked, a mentally ill person costs the state 4 marks per day, a disabled person 5.5 marks, and a criminal 3 marks. In an institution, there are 1,500 mentally ill people, 900 disabled people, and 300 criminals. How much does the state save if these people are eliminated? 10-year-old children learned arithmetic through exercises that presented mass murder as a logical solution to economic problems. Biology completely transformed into racial pseudoscience. Students dedicated whole weeks to measuring skulls, classifying hair types, studying nose shapes. They learned to identify characteristics, supposedly Jewish, Slavic, Romani. Textbooks presented photographs of people from different ethnicities with descriptions that attributed moral traits to physical characteristics. Jews were inherently liars, Slavs naturally intellectually inferior, Africans barely superior to animals. These were not debatable opinions, but scientific facts that students had to memorize to pass exams. History was perhaps the most brutally distorted discipline. Textbooks presented German history as a continuous narrative of victimization by external enemies and internal betrayal. The First World War had not been lost militarily, but by the stab in the back by Jews and communists. The Weimar Republic represented national humiliation caused by international Jewish conspiracies. The Treaty of Versailles was a crime against the German people that justified any action to restore national honor. Students learned that war was not a calamity to be avoided, but a noble test of racial vitality. New mandatory subjects completed the curricular transformation. Racial science became a central subject where students aged 12 studied the alleged genetic differences between races. Hereditary studies taught eugenics principles, the importance of avoiding reproduction with inferior individuals, the necessity of sterilizing the mentally ill and disabled, the duty of every German to contribute to racial improvement. Ideological education consisted of the direct memorization of texts by Hitler, especially passages from Mein Kampf, which were studied with the reverence traditionally reserved for religious texts. The time devoted to traditional academic education decreased dramatically. The weekly hours of German, mathematics, science, and foreign languages constantly diminished, while those dedicated to physical education and military training increased. By 1938, male students spent 5 hours a day in physical activities and only 3 in academic instruction. The Reich needed strong bodies and obedient minds, not critical intellectuals. The Adolf Hitler schools, also known as Napolis, represented the Nazi educational ideal taken to its maximum expression. These elite institutions, established in castles and confiscated mansions, selected students based on racial purity, physical aptitude, and ideological fanaticism. A typical day at a Napola began at 5 in the morning with exhausting exercises. Students were given deliberately insufficient rations to strengthen character. Academic classes were minimal, focusing almost exclusively on military history, strategic geography, and Nazi doctrine. Students learned horseback riding, fencing, shooting, and gliding. Showers were exclusively with cold water. Punishments for weakness or disobedience included severe beatings administered by older students. Jewish students who still remained in public schools until the Nuremberg laws of 1935 faced systematic humiliations designed to break them psychologically. Teachers pointed them out in class as examples of racial inferiority. Their classmates received explicit instruction not to socialize with them. During racial science lessons, Jewish children were forced to stand at the front of the classroom while the teacher pointed out their supposed inferior racial characteristics. Jewish students reported instances where teachers forced them to read aloud anti-Semitic passages from textbooks, including descriptions of Jews as parasites, rats, and diseases. Julius Streicher, editor of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, created special versions of his publication designed specifically for child audiences. Der Stiftjünger presented grotesque caricatures of Jews with exaggerated noses, deformed bodies, and sinister expressions. The stories narrated supposed Jewish crimes against German children, kidnappings, ritual murders, poisonings. A special edition claimed that Jews used the blood of Christian children to make Easter bread. These publications were distributed free of charge in schools and were formally incorporated into the curriculum in many institutions. Teachers who tried to resist Nazification faced devastating consequences. Elisabeth Schmitz, a Protestant teacher in Berlin, wrote in 1935 a detailed memorandum documenting the abuses against Jewish students in her school. She was immediately fired and subjected to constant surveillance by the Gestapo. Friedrich Rust, a school principal in Hamburg, refused to implement the racial curriculum and allowed Jewish students to continue participating normally. He was arrested in 1938 and sent to a concentration camp where he died 6 months later. Educational dissent was considered treason punishable by the destruction of careers and lives. By 1939, a whole generation of German children had grown up without access to real education. They had learned arithmetic through problems about the extermination of undesirables. They had studied biology that presented racism as science. They had memorized stories that justified military aggression. They had spent more time marching than reading. The German educational system, once recognized worldwide for its excellence, had transformed into a factory of fanaticism that produced intellectually impoverished but ideologically pure youth, incapable of critical thinking, but perfectly prepared to serve as instruments of a genocidal state. Child propaganda, poisoning minds since the cradle. Joseph Goebbels understood a fundamental truth about effective propaganda. It had to begin before children developed critical thinking skills. The Ministry of Propaganda designed a massive multimedia campaign specifically aimed at shaping young minds from the earliest age. This campaign was not limited to obvious political messages, but penetrated every aspect of children's culture, transforming stories, toys, songs, and entertainment into vehicles of indoctrination. The children's book Der Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, published in 1938 by Julius Streicher, exemplified the perversion of children's literature. The title itself established the central metaphor. Just as poisonous mushrooms disguise themselves among edible mushrooms, Jews hide among Germans to poison society. The book contained 17 short stories, each illustrated with drawings depicting Jews with grotesquely long noses, dirty beards, hunched bodies, and malevolent expressions. One story narrated how a German mother taught her daughter to identify Jews by observing their physical characteristics. Another described a Jew attempting to seduce an Aryan girl to contaminate her blood. A third showed a Jewish teacher sexually harassing students. Each story concluded with the same lesson. Jews were mortal enemies who needed to be avoided and eventually eliminated. Do not trust any fox on green heath and any Jew under his oath. Do not trust any fox on the green moor or any Jew under oath, represented another example of poisoned children's literature. Published in 1936, this book combined catchy rhymes with colorful illustrations that depicted scenes of supposed Jewish perfidy. One page showed a Jewish merchant selling defective goods to naive Germans. Another illustrated a Jewish doctor poisoning Aryan patients. The book was mass-distributed in primary schools and became mandatory reading for children aged 6 to 10. Teachers used its stories as a basis for lessons where students identified Jewish characteristics in photographs and learned to distrust Jewish neighbors. The cinematic production aimed at youth-combined entertainment with subtle but effective indoctrination. Hitler Youth Quecks, released in 1933, told the story of Heini Völker, a teenager who abandons his communist family to join the Hitler Youth. The film depicted communists as violent criminals who beat Heini and murdered children. Members of the Hitler Youth appeared as noble heroes, singing inspiring songs as they marched through orderly streets. The climax came when Heini was stabbed by communists while distributing Nazi propaganda, becoming a martyr. The film ended with thousands of Nazi youth marching over his grave as the voice of the Führer proclaimed the eternal victory of National Socialism. Students from all over Germany were obliged to watch this film, and many reported leaving the cinema desiring to emulate Heine's sacrifice. Judd Seuss, although targeted at adult audiences, was also screened for older teenagers with the explicit purpose of generating visceral hatred towards Jews. The film presented Joseph Seuss Oppenheimer, an 18th century Jewish financier, as a monster who violated Aryan women, stole from the state, and conspired to destroy Germany. The scenes were designed to provoke physical repulsion. Bearded Jews eating noisily, negotiating money with exaggerated gestures, and lusting after German women. The climax showed Seuss being hanged while German crowds celebrated. Heinrich Himmler ordered that all members of the SS and the police watch the film. Many perpetrators of the Holocaust later cited this film as a factor that intensified their anti-Semitism. The youth Nazi radio operated daily with programming specifically designed for different age groups. The programs for children aged 6 to 10 featured reinterpreted fairy tales where Aryan princes defeated dragons representing Jews. The adventure stories for teenagers glorified historic German battles, emphasizing the bravery of soldiers who died for the homeland. The radio dramatizations recreated moments from the history of the Nazi Party, presenting Hitler as the savior of Germany. Between programs, children's choirs sang Nazi anthems with catchy musical arrangements designed to implant in young minds. The children memorized these songs effortlessly, repeating lyrics about conquest, sacrifice, and racial supremacy. Children's toys reflected and reinforced the militarization of German childhood. Toy stores sold lead soldiers dressed in perfectly detailed SS uniforms. The sets included figures of prisoners, so that children could stage executions. The toy tanks bore authentic insignias from panzer divisions. The model airplanes reproduced Stuka bombers with technical precision. The dolls for girls exclusively represented Aryan ideals: blonde hair, blue eyes, Nordic features. Manufacturers produced dolls dressed in uniforms of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. At the same time, grotesque caricatures of dolls with exaggerated noses labeled explicitly as Jewish circulated, designed to teach girls to recognize and reject racial inferiority. Board games completed the militarization of recess time. Juden raus, Jews out, released in 1938, challenged players to capture tokens representing Jews and expel them from the city to Palestine. The player who expelled the most Jews won. Bombers over England allowed children to simulate bombings of British cities, earning points for destroying civilian targets. These games normalized violence and forced displacement as fun and desirable activities. The Deutsches Jungvolk-Kalender, an annual calendar distributed free of charge to all members of the young German people, combined practical functions with continuous indoctrination. Each page contained important dates from the Nazi calendar: birthdays of Hitler, anniversary of the Munich Putsch, commemoration of party martyrs. The illustrations showed heroic Nazi youth conquering enemies. The margins included quotes from Hitler and other Nazi leaders. Children consulted these calendars daily for school tasks, unknowingly absorbing ideological messages with each consultation. The Nazi children's songs represented perhaps the most insidious element of cultural propaganda. Simple and catchy melodies carried lyrics that glorified war and death. Es zittern die Moschen Knochen, the rotten bones tremble, sang about preparing for war, where today Germany belongs to us, tomorrow the whole world. Vorwärts, vorwärts. Forward, forward, proclaimed, our flag means more than death. Children sang these songs in schools, camps, and family gatherings. The melodies remained in their minds for decades, even after they understood the horror of their lyrics. Joseph Goebbels personally monitored the effectiveness of child propaganda through detailed reports from throughout the Reich. His diaries document satisfaction upon receiving reports from children of 8 years expressing hatred towards Jews. teenagers requesting permission to join the army before the legal age, and entire families adopting Nazi attitudes due to the influence of their indoctrinated children. For Goebbels, these reports confirmed the success of his strategy. The most effective propaganda was that which was not perceived as propaganda, but as natural and obvious truth. By 1939, an entire generation of German children had grown up immersed in this total propaganda environment. They did not know children's books without racist messages, toys without military symbolism, or songs without glorification of war. Entertainment and indoctrination had merged indistinguishably. These children could not separate their own thoughts from ideas implanted through constant repetition since childhood. The propaganda had achieved its ultimate goal, to become invisible by transforming into the only known reality, the destruction of the family, children against parents. Nazi totalitarianism required absolute loyalty that tolerated no competition, not even from the most fundamental family ties. The regime understood that as long as parents maintained moral authority over their children, there would be a limit to state influence. The solution was systematic and brutal: to transform children into spies and enforcers of the state within their own homes, turning the family institution into an ideological battlefield where brother denounced brother and son betrayed father. The official doctrine explicitly proclaimed the supremacy of the state over the family. Nazi leaders declared that the Führer was the true father of all German children, while biological parents were merely temporary guardians whose function was to raise healthy bodies for the Reich. Hitler himself stated in speeches that children did not belong to their families, but to the nation. This ideology was constantly reinforced in the Hitler Youth, where leaders explicitly instructed young people that, if their parents expressed doubts about Nazism, they should be reported to the authorities as traitors. The documented cases of children reporting their own parents reveal the depth of this family destruction. Walter Hess, a resident of Cologne for 11 years, heard his father make critical comments about Hitler during dinner in March 1936. Walter, an enthusiastic member of the Deutsches Jungvolk, immediately reported to his youth leader. The Gestapo arrested the father that very night. After a summary trial before the Volksgerichtshof, he was convicted of sedition and executed by guillotine in July of that year. Walter received public praise in his unit of the Hitler Youth for his loyalty to the Führer. His mother, heartbroken, was forced to attend the ceremony where her son was honored for causing the death of her husband. Marianne Wiese, 16 years old, and a prominent member of the League of German Girls, reported her father in 1941 for listening to radio broadcasts from the BBC, an offence that was severely punished during the war. The Gestapo burst into their home during a nighttime broadcast and arrested her father in front of the family. Marianne testified against him during the trial, stating that her father had betrayed the German people by consuming enemy propaganda. The father was sent to a concentration camp where he died in 1943. Marianne never publicly expressed remorse, but according to later testimonies from family members, she attempted suicide 3 times in the 1950s, tormented by the guilt of her betrayal. The magnitude of the phenomenon was considerable. The records of the Gestapo document thousands of cases where minors provided information that resulted in the arrest of family members. Between 1933 and 1945, approximately 20% of the reports received by the secret police came from minors under 18 years old, many reporting their own parents, uncles, older brothers, or grandparents. The reported crimes varied from critical comments about the regime to helping Jews, listening to foreign radio, expressing doubts about the German victory, or simply showing a lack of enthusiasm for Nazism. The regime not only encouraged these denunciations, but publicly celebrated them as examples of superior loyalty. The children who reported would appear in local newspapers as heroes. They were awarded medals in school ceremonies. Their photographs were displayed on community bulletin boards. This public recognition rewarded the act of informing, encouraged other children to emulate the behavior, and sent a terrifying message to all German parents that there was no safety even in the intimacy of home. The specific training in the Hitler Youth systematically reinforced this behavior. Youth leaders explicitly taught children to monitor family conversations, identify defeatist or anti-German comments, and immediately report any ideological deviation. During indoctrination sessions, instructors presented hypothetical scenarios. What would you do if you heard your father criticizing the Führer? The correct answer, emphasized repeatedly, was immediate denunciation. Children who expressed doubts about betraying their families faced public humiliation and accusations of racial weakness. Generational conflicts reached unsustainable levels of tension in millions of German households. Parents who had lived in pre-Nazi Germany were trying to preserve traditional values of critical thinking, compassion, and independent morality. Their children, fully indoctrinated, viewed them as relics of a weak and defeated era. Family dinners became ideological battlefields. Parents learned to keep silent about their true thoughts. The children interpreted this silence as a suspicious lack of enthusiasm. The fundamental trust between parents and children disintegrated under the pressure of totalitarianism. Hans Scholl, later a member of the White Rose resistance group, was reported to the authorities by his 13-year-old younger brother in 1938 for expressing doubts about the war. Although Hans avoided serious consequences on that occasion, the incident destroyed the relationship between brothers and exemplified how Nazism penetrated even relationships among peers of the same generation. Some families tried to actively resist the indoctrination of their children, facing devastating consequences. Elizabeth and Franz Jägerstätter, devout Catholics in Austria, refused to allow their children to participate in the Hitler Youth. Authorities responded by arresting both parents in 1940 for sabotage of the youth war effort. The children were placed in state institutions where they received intensive indoctrination. Franz was subsequently executed for refusing mandatory military service. The children, fully indoctrinated in the state institutions, refused to recognize their mother when she was finally released in 1945. The Lebensborn program represented the most extreme institutional expression of family subordination to the state. This SS initiative removed children considered racially valuable from families deemed inadequate and placed them with politically reliable families or in state institutions. Between 1935 and 1945, approximately 20,000 German children were removed from their biological homes under this program. Additionally, in occupied territories, especially Poland and Norway, the SS kidnapped between 100,000 and 200,000 children considered to appear Aryan in order to forcibly Germanize them. These children were separated from their families, their names changed, and subjected to intensive indoctrination to eliminate any memory of their origins. The long-term psychological trauma in families affected by these dynamics was devastating and permanent. Children who had reported their parents faced decades of guilt once the Nazi regime collapsed, and they understood the magnitude of their actions. Many never managed to reconcile with surviving relatives. The suicides among former members of the Hitler Youth who had betrayed their families reached significantly high rates in the decades of the 1950s and 60s. The psychologists who worked with this population documented cases of severe depression, anxiety disorders, and inability to form trusting relationships. By 1945, millions of German families had been permanently fractured by the Nazi project of subordinating familial loyalty to state loyalty. Surviving parents and children faced unfathomable chasms of distrust and resentment that were impossible to bridge. The family institution, traditionally the most basic refuge against state tyranny, had been transformed into an instrument of totalitarian control, and the scars of this perversion would persist for generations. Child soldiers, the last sacrificed generation. When the tide of war turned irreversibly against Germany, the Nazi regime resorted to its most precious and vulnerable resources, the children it had spent a decade indoctrinating. What followed was one of the darkest tragedies of the Second World War. The massive use of adolescents and children as combatants in desperate battles, where thousands died defending a lost cause with a fanaticism that only systematic indoctrination could produce. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, formed in June 1943, represented the first mass mobilization of teenagers as a combat military unit. This division exclusively recruited members of the Hitler Youth born in 1926, boys of 17 years without prior military experience. 10,000 young people were selected based on their ideological fanaticism and physical fitness. The training lasted only 6 months, insufficient to prepare professional soldiers, but adequate to create suicide fighters unafraid of death. The Hitler Youth Division participated in some of the bloodiest battles on the Western Front. During the defense of Normandy following the Allied landing in June 1944, these teenagers fought with surprising ferocity. Canadian and British soldiers reported shock upon discovering they were facing 15- and 16-year-old children. The boys of the Hitler Youth fought to the death, refusing to surrender even in impossible situations. In hand-to-hand combat in the streets of Caen, German teenagers attacked Allied tanks with explosive charges, knowing they would die in the attempt. Their tactics were reckless: frontal assaults against fortified positions, refusal to retreat under any circumstances, summary executions of comrades who showed cowardice. The casualty rates in the division were catastrophic. In the first 3 months of fighting in Normandy, the Hitlerjugend division lost more than 60% of its initial strength. By the end of August in 1944, of the original complement of 10,000 youths, fewer than 3,000 remained alive and uninjured. The division was rebuilt with new recruits who were equally young, only to be destroyed again in the Ardennes in December of that year. The cycle repeated: indoctrination, deployment, annihilation, replacement. The boys died by the thousands defending positions of no strategic value, sacrificed for an ideology that regarded them as disposable ammunition. The creation of the Volkssturm in September 1944 marked the total militarization of the civilian population, including children and the elderly. Joseph Goebbels proclaimed that every German capable of holding a weapon had to defend the fatherland. The minimum age, officially set at 16 years, was consistently ignored. Children of 14, 13, even 12 years were forcibly recruited. In the final months of the war, entire schools were emptied as teachers took their students directly from classrooms to defensive positions. The training of the Volkssturm was practically non-existent. The children were given improvised uniforms, often simply armbands, and obsolete or captured weapons. Many carried rifles from the First World War without proper ammunition. The main armament consisted of Panzerfausts, single-use anti-tank rocket launchers that required getting within less than 50 meters of the target. Sending 13-year-old children against Soviet T-34 tanks with these weapons was a death sentence. The boys died by the dozens in suicidal attempts to stop the unstoppable advance of the Red Army. The defense of Berlin in April and May of 1945 exposed the final depravity of the Nazi regime. While Hitler remained in his bunker, thousands of children fought in the streets of the capital. Photographs of German prisoners captured by Soviets show faces of 12 and 13 years, dressed in helmets that are too big for them, with expressions of terror and confusion. These children operated 88mm anti-aircraft guns against ground tanks, completely exposed positions where they died under artillery fire. They defended improvised barricades with rifles that they could barely hold. They threw Panzerfausts from the windows of ruined buildings. Alfred Czech, 12 years old, was captured by Soviets in Berlin, carrying a Panzerfaust almost as big as he was. When interrogated about why he was fighting, he replied that his leader from the Hitler Youth had told him that the Russians would kill his family if he did not defend the city. Willi Hübner, 15 years old, was operating an anti-aircraft gun when a Soviet grenade destroyed his position. He survived with both legs amputated. In the military hospital, as he was dying from infection, he sang hymns of the Hitler Youth. his indoctrination so deep that neither pain nor the obvious betrayal of his leaders could break it. The fanaticism of these child soldiers horrified even veteran soldiers from both sides. German officers reported cases of boys of 14 years executing adult soldiers summarily for suggesting surrender. The children, indoctrinated to consider surrender as treason punishable by death, applied this logic brutally. In the final weeks of the war, execution teams from the SS patrolled Berlin, hanging soldiers accused of cowardice from lampposts. Many executioners were teenagers from the Hitler Youth. The Soviet soldiers were traumatized to discover the youth of many German combatants. Vasily Grossman, a Soviet war correspondent, wrote in his diary about the capture of a German defensive position, where they found 17 bodies, all of boys between 12 and 16 years old. The Russian soldiers, many of them fathers themselves, were so affected by the sight that they refused to loot the bodies, as was common practice. A Soviet tank commander described the distress of crushing with his vehicle a German boy of approximately 13 years who had attempted to attack him with a magnetic mine. "He was barely older than my own son," he wrote. "I couldn't even hate him." The atrocities committed by youth units during this final period further tarnished this tragedy. Young boys from the Hitlerjugend participated in the massacres of prisoners of war and civilians in the final months of the conflict. In March of 1945, a unit of teenagers executed 200 Polish prisoners of war near Dresden. In April, youth members of the Volkssturm participated in the massacre of forced laborers in concentration camps during evacuation marches. The indoctrination had produced children capable of committing war crimes with no apparent remorse. The fate of the survivors was dark and prolonged. Many of the captured child soldiers spent years in Soviet prisoner camps, where they faced hunger, forced labor, and additional trauma. Those who were released eventually returned to a destroyed Germany, where they discovered that their leaders had betrayed them, sacrificing them in a lost war for a criminal cause. Many never managed to reintegrate into civilian society. The rates of suicide, alcoholism, and domestic violence among former Nazi child soldiers remained high for generations. Estimates of children killed in combat in the last 6 months of the war vary, but conservative researchers estimate at least 20,000 minors under 18 years old killed defending the Reich. Other estimates place the figure at 40,000 or more. These numbers do not include children killed in bombings, forced evacuations, or as collateral victims of urban combat. A whole generation was literally sacrificed by a genocidal ideology that had systematically indoctrinated it from childhood to accept death as a glorious destiny. Consequences and legacy. The price of a stolen childhood. On the 8th of May, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, millions of young Germans faced an existential collapse. The reality they had known since childhood, the truths they considered absolute, the purpose that defined their lives, all revealed itself as a lie. The process of awakening from this mass indoctrination would be long, painful, and for many, impossible to complete. The Allies initiated denazification programs designed to purge Nazi ideology from German society. Between 1945 and 1949, millions of Germans were subjected to extensive questionnaires, categorizing them according to their level of complicity with the regime. Young people presented a unique challenge. Many had been so deeply indoctrinated that they could not conceive of an identity separate from Nazism. 15-year-old children questioned by Allied officers answered questions about Hitler with the same religious devotion they had shown during the war. Loyalty to the Führer was not political but psychological, rooted in their developing personalities. The re-education programs attempted to counteract years of propaganda with exposure to historical truth. Young Germans were shown footage of liberated concentration camps. They were taken on forced visits to Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The intention was to provoke a moral shock that would break the indoctrination. For some, it worked. The encounter with the reality of the Holocaust destroyed their illusions about Nazism. But for many others, cognitive dissonance proved insurmountable. Confronted with undeniable evidence of atrocities committed in the name of the ideology they had adored, some simply refused to believe. They insisted that the footage was Allied propaganda, that the testimonies of survivors were fabrications, that the horrors were exaggerations. This psychological resistance to abandoning beliefs acquired in childhood persisted for decades. Sociological studies from the 1950s and 60s documented that former members of the Hitler Youth maintained authoritarian, xenophobic, and nationalist attitudes at significantly higher rates than Germans who had reached adulthood before Nazism. Childhood indoctrination had left indelible marks on their thought structures. Even those who intellectually rejected Nazism found that their instinctive emotional reactions reflected Nazi conditioning: visceral distrust of foreigners, discomfort with diversity, aesthetic appreciation of authoritarian symbols. The phenomenon of Schweigen, the silence, dominated the indoctrinated generation for decades. Faced with guilt, shame, and unbearable cognitive dissonance, millions simply refused to discuss their Nazi past. Parents did not talk to their children about their youth in the Hitler Youth. Grandparents avoided questions about the war. This generational silence created a historical void where there should have been a transmission of memory. The refusal to confront the past allowed revisionist myths to flourish: that the majority of Germans did not know about the Holocaust, that they were victims of Hitler just as much as others, and that their participation was forced and involuntary. The impact on fatherhood was profound and complex. Former members of the Hitler Youth who had children in the 1950s and 60s faced impossible dilemmas. They had been raised in a system that valued blind obedience, total conformity, and fanatical loyalty. They did not know parenting models based on autonomy, critical thinking, or individuality. Some replicated authoritarian patterns learned in their youth, raising their children with brutal discipline and demands for absolute obedience. Others, horrified by their own past, adopted extreme permissiveness, refusing to impose any structure for fear of reproducing their own indoctrination. The children of this generation grew up with psychologically damaged parents, unable to provide consistent moral guidance. Suicide cases among former child soldiers and prominent members of the Hitler Youth reached epidemic proportions in the 1950s. Mental health records in Allied occupation zones document severe depression rates among veterans under 25 years old that are more than 30% higher than those of adult soldiers. The trauma of having killed and seen comrades die in battles for a cause revealed as criminal was psychologically unsustainable. Many developed post-traumatic stress disorder decades before the condition was formally recognized. Without proper treatment, without vocabulary to describe their suffering, without social support in a society that preferred to forget, thousands simply did not manage to survive the peace. Modern educational programs in Germany represent the most serious effort of any nation to confront its totalitarian past. Starting from the decade of 1970, the German school curriculum began to address the Holocaust and Nazi indoctrination with unprecedented honesty. Students visit sites of concentration camps as a mandatory part of their education. They study testimonies of survivors. They analyze Nazi propaganda to understand manipulation techniques. These lessons have a dual purpose: to honor the memory of the victims and to vaccinate new generations against ideological manipulation. The legacy of Nazi indoctrination offers warnings that transcend specific historical context. The German case demonstrates the particular vulnerability of children and adolescents to systematic manipulation. Developing brains lack the necessary experience and critical thinking to resist coordinated propaganda. When indoctrination begins early enough and is applied thoroughly enough, it can permanently shape cognitive and emotional structures. The parallels with other cases of mass youth indoctrination are disturbing. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia used children as executors of genocide after years of indoctrination that portrayed educated adults as class enemies. The child soldiers of ISIS were indoctrinated through strikingly similar techniques to the Hitler Youth: separation from moderating family influences, immersion in totalitarian ideology, glorification of violence, and martyrdom. North Korea maintains youth indoctrination systems that produce fanatical loyalty generation after generation. Each case confirms the same terrifying lesson. With sufficient control over the childhood environment, any ideology can be deeply implanted. The lessons to prevent future manipulation of minors are clear but difficult to implement. Education must emphasize critical thinking, not memorization of dogma. Children need exposure to diverse perspectives, not uniform indoctrination. Families should remain as shelters of individual autonomy, not subordinate themselves to state imperatives. Societies must value constructive dissent, not punish nonconformity. But these protections require constant vigilance, for the temptation of totalitarianism never completely disappears. The last survivors of the generation indoctrinated by Nazism are now over 80 years old. In their last decades, many finally broke decades of silence, offering testimonies about their experiences. These accounts reveal the devastating human cost of indoctrination: lives defined by guilt, relationships destroyed by childish betrayals, identities fractured by the impossibility of reconciling the indoctrinated child with the conscious adult. Some express deep remorse, others hold on to fragments of nostalgia for the certainty and belonging that the Hitler Youth offered. Most simply express sadness for stolen childhoods, for having been used as instruments of evil before having the capacity to resist. The history of Nazi youth indoctrination serves as a constant warning about the vulnerability of children to systemic manipulation. It demonstrates how totalitarian regimes can transform entire generations into instruments of their purposes through control over education, culture, family, and society. It confirms that protecting children's autonomy and developing critical thinking are not pedagogical luxuries, but essential defenses against future totalitarianism. And finally, it documents the terrible price children pay when societies allow extremist ideologies to capture the most vulnerable minds.